Welcome to The Rest is Politics with me, Alastair Campbell.
And me, Rory Stewart.
And this is the first time we've been together since last week's local and mayoral elections. So we'll talk about that, talk a little bit about the yet another SNP leader and soon-to-be First Minister. And then in the second half, fascinating interview with my friend Emannuel Macron, where I suspect I'll be more positive than you, in The Economist, with another of my friends, Sophie Pedder, the Paris bureau chief. And then I think we both also want to talk about the upcoming elections at the end of this month in South Africa, which are absolutely fascinating for all sorts of reasons, some of them not very good. So let's imagine, Roy, that you were the Tory party spokesperson who was sent into the studios on Saturday morning. What was your line on the local elections?
Well, warning for listeners, which is that this was not a good election for the Tories. So I'm about to play a little bit of a game here. Don't take it literally that this is what I actually think. But the best case I think that the Tories could have made is that Labour was not as far ahead in the local elections as you would have expected, given where they are in the polls. So, Alastair, you're encouraging me to take the Tory point of view, and I'll try to put that point so people understand the way that you can make an argument against Labour. But the overall picture, of course, is that the Conservatives did pretty badly, and Labour is in a relatively comfortable position. Here's the but. The but is that traditionally you would expect a party in a local election going into a general like this, a party like Labour that's this far ahead in the polls, to have done better than they did in terms of the national vote. So Labour did quite well in individual seats, very well, for example, we can talk about this in the West Midlands, which would be a big victory for them. But the overall results in these 2024 elections are that the Conservatives were on 24% of the national vote, imputed. It's quite difficult to calculate. Labour on about 34%. Lib Dems on about 17%. So Labour probably had between a 7 and a 9-point lead nationally. Compare that to where you were in 1995. Or if you look at 2008, the Conservatives were nearly 20 points ahead. Conservatives were on 44%, Labour on 24% going into the Cameron election. So I think that's one thing. And I think the second thing that you might say if you were trying to look for anxieties for Labour, Labour's performance in seats with big Muslim populations will have been really disappointing for them. If you look at seats which have more than 20% of their population being Muslim voters, there seemed to be an average 18% drop in the Labour vote, and that's almost certainly associated with Gaza. But beyond that, broadly speaking, pretty good day for Labour. Over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think Rishi Sunak played into Labour's hands in a bizarre sort of way by his response seems to be, we could be heading for a hung parliament, and they're going to try to do the same thing that David Cameron did, stability against chaos, which just doesn't, I don't think that's going to work again.
And it doesn't work, so the numbers don't work. It looks like Labour's much more on track for a majority.
I also think it's Sunak kind of admitting defeat in a way. You have to fight like you're going to win, whatever the results. And look, I think there is a case to be made for Labour genuinely not to be complacent about these results. Two reasons. One, as you say, the vote share. And secondly, they cannot take for granted that all the people who didn't vote, but who will vote in a general election, are necessarily either going to fall in the same way, or that they're all essentially not voting because they don't like the Tories. A lot of them will not be voting because they don't care, or because they're actually just a part of this general anti-politics mood. And I think that Labour did very well. What I think Labour will be very heartened by is by the operation that they ran. They did best in the places where they really need to do well to get a majority.
So they were very good at targeting. So even if the big national vote share wasn't that great, where they concentrated their vote, it was very effective, particularly in taking key mayoralties.
Not just the key mayoralties, but also in terms of, so to give you an example, I got a message from somebody who said that, rather grumbling and groaning, that who'd been campaigning in London for Sadiq Khan, that they'd been asked to take their team up to the West Midlands.
Right. Which can really annoy people.
Which does really annoy people. Yeah. But actually, when you look at how big Sadiq's win was, obviously thanks to the fact that he came on the podcast, I imagine, and then compare that with how close it was in the West Midlands. That was a sensible thing to do, to put your resources. So they're clearly targeting resources where they need them, which is a good thing to do in a campaign. The Lib Dems did well in the places where they want to do well and where Labour want to do them well. I think where Labour would be more worried relates to what you just said about Gaza. So, for example, in Bristol, where Thangam Debonair is a member of the Shadow Cabinet, and if Labour win and she gets elected, would be the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, the Greens did incredibly well there. Now, that may be related to climate, but I suspect what's happening is that Gaza, allied to this sense that Labour are not giving the progressive young voter much of a reason to go out and vote for them. And I think that's where Labour understand there is now a gap, and they've got to fill that gap. Because I still believe that a landslide is possible, but if I were looking at these results very, very coldly, I wouldn't say that was indicating that there's one that is likely as things stand.
It's interesting, isn't it? We've got a couple of things we're going to be doing this week. One is these local election results, and the other is that we're now doing our own Restless Politics tracker poll, looking every month at results. We'll get a bit into that in an episode later this week. But you're absolutely right. There's possible small signs that some of the Labour vote may be softening a little bit. Can I just step back, though, a little bit on local elections in general? Because I think it is a bit confusing for the public. Generally, in my experience anyway, the media gets very, very excited by local election results because I guess it's an opportunity between elections to play out a general election. It's really about playing out the general election, which is often a bit unfair to local councillors.
It's totally unfair.
For whom these results really matter.
It's awful. That's why I think it's so sad when you see, like, I take Andy Street in the West Midlands. We interviewed him on Leading with Andy Burnham. I think we both found him quite impressive. As a Labour person, I'm obviously glad that Labour won that. It was a big moment on last Friday. But the truth is, he probably lost because of the National Conservative brand. Now, that says to me that the public are slightly buying into the line that this is just like a national opinion poll. But if the media are going to cover it like that, and it's always been the same, but I think it's got worse. There's very little focus on any local issues, and what local government does, where it differs from national government.
And when I was running in the London mayoral race, I was very, very conscious that here was this incredible election for this enormous city, almost 10 million people.
Yeah.
Just how difficult it was to get national coverage. And actually one of the reasons it's quite difficult for somebody who's to establish their brand apart from a party is because of that. So there wasn't, for example, in the London mayoral races, at least when I was running, really big national television debates, the sort of things that I was able to use when I was running to be Prime Minister. So I think this is a really interesting point, your point about media coverage. I experienced it very directly in the contrast within a few months between running to be Tory party leader and Prime Minister, where, of course, I was able, as an incumbent, a sort of insurgent, to get a lot of coverage in national newspapers. And of course, the television debates were hugely helpful in allowing me to really kind of position myself and get my name recognition up. In the London mayoral race, although London is huge, 10 million people.
Twice as big as Scotland.
Yeah, twice as big as Scotland, exactly. Enormous part of our economy. Very, very difficult to get the national newspapers to focus on the London mayoral race, and therefore quite difficult to take on an established party brand because there weren't a big television debates watched by everybody, which I could go on as an independent and challenge Sadiq Khan directly. Andy Street also, for me, I think very sad. He represents the best version of the Conservative picture. He wasn't very ideological. In fact, he ran a campaign really trying to separate himself from the party. He's somebody who I think loved the West Midlands, had some pretty thoughtful, exciting ideas around industrial strategy, of course had this great backstory, very, very successful business person, and strangely also quite, as we found when we interviewed him, quite a sort of quiet, introverted figure for a big business leader. And so that's a real loss. The only place that the Conservatives managed to keep was Ben Houchen, who you find much more problematic than Andy Street.
I do, and I think it will end in tears. And I also think, from Rishi Sunak's perspective, there was something rather pathetic about the way that he Houchen, having run a campaign which was basically saying, "I am Ben Houchen, I am not the Tory party," up in the Tees Valley with this Tees work thing. And by the way, I think the denigration and demise of local media been a big thing, which also hasn't helped local democracy. And I really do think there's something absolutely rotten about this whole Tees Works thing, which I think is now on the map. And I think that could become a problem as we go forward. But I think the other thing I would say about Andy Street is that he showed how to be gracious in defeat in a way that the awful Susan Hall did not. And I think, do you know, one of the things I say about Sadiq Khan, because there was this rumour went round that he was losing. I don't know if you were on top of this. It was everywhere. I was getting dozens of messages.
And presumably this is the Tory machine trying to generate a sense of excitement.
I don't know, but this was after the polls had closed. I wondered if it wasn't a betting scam that was going on. But I was getting literally...
Explain to me about these betting scams, because you've explained to me in the past, you said there was a rumour a week ago there was going to be a general election, which you thought was all about people making money. How does this work, these rumours?
Well, you get a rumour going that... So people assumed that Sadiq Khan was going to win. You get a rumour going that, in fact, he's lost. So the odds
tip in
change.
Your favour. Yeah.
And therefore you can get bigger bets on.
Got you.
For better odds.
And the same with the general election. You suspected that was also people trying to make money when we had this big
I don't know, but
week.
if you think about all the money that was made by and it's not just betting, by the way, I'm talking about shorting the pound and all the stuff that went on during Brexit.
Yeah.
But the rumour went round, and somebody, when the result was announced and Sadiq had won by an even bigger majority than before, somebody pointed out, and I think there's something in here for the Labour leadership as a whole to reckon on. One, and I think we saw this when we interviewed Sadiq Khan for leading, he didn't indulge in the stuff that was being thrown at him. He talked about it when we asked about him, the racism, the death threats, etc. But he didn't sort of go down to that. And the second thing is, I think he did show in relation to ULEZ, paying more to travel drive a car, that you can, provided you're doing it from a position of conviction and showing the benefits in terms of air quality and so forth, you can stand up for really difficult positions. I think the other thing that Sadiq did, and again, we asked him about this in the interview, given he was complaining about the lack of powers, for example, in relation to education, how come he made free school meals a big thing? He made it a big thing in part because he believes in it, but also to show that differentiation. And so I think that's where the Labour Party nationally now, they have to have some sort of really clear, direct, simple policy ideas that people can go, that's why I'm supporting them. And at the moment, it still feels like they're fighting very much on the big picture.
We'll come back to this on the polls, but one thing we've talked about in the past is that sometimes even embracing something that might be a little bit unpopular can be a good idea, because at least people know what you believe in. And that may be true with ULEZ. It may not be incredibly popular with all his voters, but at least it gives a sense that Sadiq Khan stands for something and is doing something. Just step back 1 second more on local council elections, because again, as an explainer, first thing is they're very strange in the sense that not every council goes to the election at the same time. So different years have a hugely different number of councils. So some years you have all as Scottish Parliament, Welsh Assembly, Northern Ireland going at the same time as local councils. You have some bumper years where almost all the big councils are going together. And all the thing is affected by the fact that some councils, like my own council in Cumbria, Cumberland Council, goes all in, all out, and last had its election in 2022, so we won't have another one for some time. Some of them go out in thirds. Mm-hmm. So you have this incredible confusion about our local system. So you have mayors going. Since 2011, we've had police and crime commissioners. There are metropolitan areas. There are London boroughs. And that means that it's a confusing thing to read for a national picture, because you can have very, very local issues. When if I think back to my time in Cumbrian politics, often you would find independents would win, or you would find a particular Conservative councillor would beat the national trend because they'd done a good job, or the Lib Dems would have really had a great operation going to local level. And I think the final thing is the way in which winning local councils can help you in the general election, really pioneered, of course, by the Lib Dems. So Tim Farron, who was my neighbour in Cumbria, took what was a very safe Conservative seat, partly because the Lib Dems had very patiently chipped away and taken all the council seats until eventually they got in a position where they had... Yeah.
I think the other thing is morale. Party morale is incredibly important. And somebody who works on the Labour team sent me this very interesting message. We've now built a mayoral pathway from London to the Scottish borders and from the East Coast to the Irish Sea, cities, towns and suburbs, and basically saying that the only place where they set out to win where they lost was Harlow. So that is good for morale, and that is also good for telling the party, when you get a message from the centre, do this, not that, they're more likely to listen to you and be disciplined if they think that you're winning.
And in the other direction, of course, as an MP, we all campaign for our local elections. So all the elected MPs will have spent the last few weeks delivering leaflets on behalf of their local councillors, campaigning for their local mayors.
Although lots of them were told to stay away.
Well, that's a new world because they're so toxic, nobody wants them around.
Yeah.
And then we all turn up to the count. And of course, the local councillors are usually the absolute core of your local party. They're often the officers of your local party. They're the most active members of your local party. So you're deeply dependent on them for selection, deselection, and just boots on the ground. So when they lose their seats, it's very, very painful. These are often people that the local MP has known for 10 or 15 years, losing their seats, and then the anger really flows up.
And the blame game gets played.
Yeah. And so the most dramatic examples we had in the Conservative Party is it was partly local elections and above all European elections, which massively affected the Tory party's lurch to the right in 2013, 14 and 2019. So that's another sort of morale point. It's not exactly the just the sort of national polling. It's the sense that these things can be incredible blows. So European elections, 2014, you'll remember that was the moment at which Nigel Farage managed to get 27% of the national vote. So he was the first party other than Conservative and Labour to win the most of the national vote since 1906. And that was one of the things that really contributed to the Conservatives leaning into this Brexit referendum and the 2015 referendum. And then again in 2019, Theresa May completely humiliated in the local elections and again in the European elections is one of the things that led to Boris Johnson coming through. Yeah,
on Farage and reform and the media, actually. I thought it was one of the most ridiculous decisions of modern BBC Times to have as their big news-making interview Suella Braverman on Sunday morning. Utterly ridiculous. Basically, I think one of the messages of these elections is actually the far right are being rejected. And yet they platformed her in that way. Farage, it seems to me, has found, he's sort of given up talking about Brexit because it's such a disaster. He's moved on from net zero. He's now got this new buzzword, which is sectarianism.
And sectarianism, presumably Islamophobia?
Race-based.
Race-based.
Absolutely race-based. So he's endlessly posting videos of, Muslims behaving in a way that he finds unacceptable. The Daily Mail are kicking in on the same kick. GB News doubtless will do the same.
And I saw on social media that people on that side of the party are beginning to list the number of Muslim mayors that we have in Britain. Yeah.
As if per se, because they're Muslim, that is a terrible thing.
Yeah.
And he posted a video of something happening in Burnley the other week. And is this what we want for our country to be? Well, I was in Burnley at the weekend and it felt pretty English to me. Anyway, the other point, I think, just before we move on, Sunak does seem to be safe, but only because even these ridiculous rebels realise that change prime ministers yet again before an election would be utterly absurd. But the other thing that's crazy about his analysis that these results suggest to hung parliament is there were no elections in Scotland. And I think Scotland's been making use of its own. Humza Yousaf gone. John Swinney, who was he leader almost 20 years ago?
Tell us, so John Swinney's a real veteran figure, and I got that one wrong. I thought he was too closely associated with the kind of old establishment of the SNP with Salmond and Sturgeon to be a plausible figure to come through. It would seem too sort of old-fashioned at a time when they need new leadership, but I was completely wrong. And he's come through. Tell us a bit about Swinney.
Well, I know him reasonably well, and I think he's very likeable, very personable, obviously very experienced. The last time he was leader of the SNP, one of the reasons they didn't really cut through in the way that they did under Salmond and Sturgeon is that he lacked the kind of X factor that you possibly need in modern politics. But I think he's now got a different sort of X factor, which is experience. However, he is fundamentally part of the Salmond Sturgeon story, which has become a negative. He has been associated with most of the public services in Scotland, which are not deemed to be doing terribly well. And it does feel a little bit like a party before country stitch-up. There was talk of other contenders being there, but they managed to use pretty old-fashioned politics, I think, to keep them out. I think he'll do a perfectly good job of stabilising the crisis, but I think actually it's like a mirror of what's happening in UK politics and the Conservative Party. It just feels like we're getting nothing but chaos.
Yeah.
So leader after leader after leader, and to go back always feels to me like a
strange thing to do.
Strange thing to do, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess it's a bit of a sort of risk-return calculation, isn't it? Because presumably there would have been some people in the SNP saying, let's take a risk, let's get a new leader in. There would have been people supporting Kate Forbes, for example, suggesting maybe if they got it right, you could bring in somebody who could really wake people up and strengthen their pretty calamitous position. But of course there's risk. I guess that could go horribly wrong. So I think they've gone from the minimized damage solution.
They're playing safe. He is the classic sort of been there, done that, done lots of different jobs, play safe with John Swinney. I thought it was interesting in his speech and the Q&A that followed it when he was when he got the leadership. He said something quite interesting, I thought. He talked about how politics had become horribly polarized, and then said that he had been part of the problem, which I thought was quite an interesting thing.
That's great.
Yeah. And then I think the other thing was he talked about independence, but it was very sotto voce. It was very much, we've got to focus on jobs and the health service and cost of living. And now I understand why he's doing that, but I think in a funny sort of way that also plays into Labour's hands, because it won't heal the divisions that led to the problems for Hamza Yousaf, which are essentially those within the SNP who think they're going cold on independence and the next referendum, and those who think that they've got to defend themselves better on public services.
And this is represented at its extreme, presumably, slightly by Alex Salmond's Alba party, which, because Salmond's instinct is you need to go full-throated on independence. And of course, he's also slightly worried about some of the transgender policies. So I guess, continuity, apparent safety, but as you say, I guess Labour will be quite happy if the election is about delivery of public services, because that's something where it's difficult for an incumbent party to win.
Yeah, I also think that time for a change is has always been one of the most powerful messages in politics. And if you have a feeling that it's time for a change to get rid of the Tories and it's time for a change to get rid of the SNP, there's only one party who's benefiting from both of those messages, and that's Labour.
Well, there we are. So we should get the Labour leader in Scotland on, and I'd also probably see if we should put an invitation, although you'd be reluctant to do it, to get the Conservative leader in Scotland on and see.
Well,
see
I've already put in an invitation to John Swinney. So if you're listening, John, he's also the only reason I like him is he's got a very, very strong connection with the island of Tiree, which is where my father came from. In fact, I bumped into him on the beach there a few years ago.
Oh.
When I was playing bagpipes to seals.
Oh, very good.
So I don't know if John Swinney remembers, but I was getting seals to come from the water to the sound of the pipes. That's a great vision,
because that's what St Cuthbert is, our great sort of Cumbrian, Northumbrian saintly hero did. I mean, one night a monk crept out of his monastery to find out why St Cuthbert wasn't in bed, thinking he was up to naughty business with local ladies. Looked over the cliff and found him standing in the water praying in the middle of the night, freezing water, so it's off the Northumbrian coast. Then he came out of the water, and the seals came out of the water to lick his feet to warm him up. And that's a real sign of saintliness. So that's what you need to aim for next time.
Well, I was quite happy to see the seals come up and listen to the music. I do not want the seals to lick my feet. I really don't. Anyway, on the licking seals and St Cuthbert's praying, we will take a break.
Welcome back to The Rest is Politics with me, Rory Stewart.
And me, Alastair Campbell.
And we had a great thing where we were able to sit down together in person, not remotely, with Nancy Pelosi, which was great. And that's out this week. I love doing things in person. And actually, we also did a trip together to see the Prime Minister of Greece. But the lovely thing about doing things in person is I got a much stronger sense of what makes Nancy Pelosi an attractive, charismatic politician than you see when she's on television, when she can seem a bit wooden. She came into the room. She did a really good job of pretending to remember who I was, asked after my wife, asked after our charity in Afghanistan. I mean, all the stuff that you'd expect a retail politician to be able to do well. She did beautifully, and I thought was warm and attractive. What did you make of her?
Yeah, and then she basically harangued me over Iraq, which you listened to and then raised in the interview. Thank you very much for that. I will get my revenge, Rory. Don't you worry. It'll be an overheard conversation that suddenly finds its way into an interview. No, I thought she was great, and I loved her energy, and I loved her fight. We're going on to talk about this interview that Emmanuel Macron's given to The Economist, and there's a line in the interview which I love where he says that, he feels that people in France and in Europe are being dragged down by the spirit of defeat, that sort of sense of negativism and complacency. And I thought the one thing she did not have was the spirit of defeat.
No, she's absolutely extraordinary. And the story will come through when you listen to the interview, but she became a politician in her mid to late 40s. And that's very, very late. I mean, I remember being taken out to lunch in a horrible club in St. James's. This was, as you can imagine, a Conservative MP Central called White's. Oh. And this veteran Tory cabinet minister giving me lunch, said, "You have to become a member of parliament before you're 35 or you'll never go anywhere." And she came in very late by anybody's standards and has proved to completely dominate the American political scene, being counted out again and again.
By age, though, it's like Bernie Sanders has announced he's running again. She's had 19 terms. Her dad had 21. Biden, Trump. I think it's quite good that our politicians
are a little bit younger. So somebody pointed out that Bill Clinton was elected 33 years ago as president, and he's still younger than either of the candidates in the current US election.
Amazing. So he was a bit of an exception.
And then I had dinner with a very active young African, very involved in African politics, and he was making a joke and saying, it always used to be the case in Africa that we had this sort of massive gerontocracy, and that in Europe and the United States you had these kind of young dynamic figures. Now it's all flipped around, and bits of Africa and a lot of the Middle East, there are these kind of young dynamic leaders, and it's Europe and the United States that seems to have these aged figures.
Well, let's talk about a young dynamic leader, because he's in his second term as president of France and he's still in his 40s.
Amazing.
Emmanuel Macron. And I'm looking at a picture of him on the front cover of The Economist, wearing a very, very smart suit, and not a black. He normally wears black suit and black tie, but it's sort of grey with a blue tie and what looks like a very expensive watch.
Which is strange, because he's always getting in trouble for wearing expensive watches and denying he wears expensive watches, and then every time you see him, he's wearing a more and more flamboyant watch.
Well, look, I don't know anything about watches. I don't even own a watch, but it looks. The last time I saw a watch like that, it was on the wrist of Jose Mourinho. So
sure. Even if it's not worth a huge amount of money, it certainly looks like it is, and he's always getting in trouble for it. So I don't know why he keeps doing it. Now listen, let's give you a chance to make the case for Macron, because there's part of you that's really entranced by him, isn't it? And you really loved this interview and loved the thing, and you loved his speech at the Sorbonne. So tell us a little bit about what's going on here.
Because politicians don't make enough big speeches, okay?
And boy does Macron make big speeches.
So he made this 2-hour speech at the Sorbonne. The sort of it flew around the world, and it flew around all sorts of different themes and challenges and so forth. And the interview, which was, and it shows you the importance of, I think, of having. I heard this terrible thing the other day. This came from somebody at CNN. So I'm assuming it's true that CNN no longer has a full-time Delhi correspondent.
That is extraordinary.
So they're now sending from America to cover the current election.
But there is a real problem, given that CNN is really important. I mean, it's a really important central thing. There have been times, I believe, where the number of viewers on CNN have been fewer than the listeners on this podcast.
Yeah.
Which means that those major media stations are in trouble because, of course, they have incredible fixed costs. Camera crews, producers, things. So I think it would be lovely if one was in a situation where some of these wealthy philanthropists really got behind funding proper BBC-style independent international journalism, because it's obviously not making commercial sense anymore.
Well, the point I was making about this, so The Economist, there's Sophie Pedder, who's who I know quite well, who's the Economist bureau chief in Paris. So they've... So
and is she French? Or?
No. I mean, she's obviously fluent in French, but she's British. But so what's interesting, though, is that you get this sort of interview if you're kind of... Obviously, The Economist has a cachet of itself. But I think it's a really interesting interview because it's sort of... he goes into some of these bigger themes that he's constantly wants to talk about. So his three main points are essentially that geopolitically, Europe is in real danger because of Putin and Ukraine, and the real danger that if he wins in Ukraine, then it's Poland or it's Lithuania or it's Latvia or it's Moldova, whatever. The second is on the economy. We are, complacency, by the way, links all of these. We are falling behind the USA and China, we, as it were, Europe, falling behind on tech, falling behind on innovation and so forth. And then this third point is that we've got this populist nationalism in most of our countries, which is a kind of easy thing to play. It's an easy game to play. It's an easy drug for people to take, and it's doing fundamental damage, and it's adding to the problems of 1 and 2. Now, I think that, and then he's got some ideas about how to address that. But of course, he's only the leader of one admittedly big country in Europe, and underpinning and sort of going through Sophie's analysis of the thing is, well, this is all great and interesting and would be possible, but he's not very popular at home, and he's got a terrible relationship with Olaf Scholz in Germany.
Yeah, again, just to look at it. So you're absolutely right. He's got this big vision: security, economics, democratic politics. He's got a big story about the last kind of 40 years of European history. And he thinks that now is the time for Europe to kind of rebuild its military, become more independent of the United States. He's signaling, and this got some headlines, that maybe France could produce a nuclear umbrella to protect other countries. And he's got a big story around, how Europe can begin to take the lead on space, on AI, on quantum computing. And then he's got a big story about kind of big democratic rebirth in Europe. And I think, first, just for a second, I mean, it's completely unlike anything that any British politician would give us an interview, but it's also completely unlike anything that any German politician would give us an interview. I mean, the whole style of the thing is just 30,000 feet. And, he quotes Marc Bloch and he quotes Paul Valéry. And he's got these amazing moments, just to tease him a little bit, where there is a slight sense of kind of French ego and Macron ego. So there's a lovely moment where in the interview he says, Russia's been making some advance in Ukraine, despite all the efforts made by France. And then he pauses and he says, but also Germany and the US. Now, to put that in context, the US is literally spending 10 times more than the nearest.
And Germany is spending more than France as well.
Yeah. And he actually totally neglects to mention Britain in that particular context. Actually, Britain's also done quite a lot.
Although he does mention Britain in the context of future European defence.
Then he talks about himself, and he says, luckily I have been able to keep going because of my iron will. I don't know what an iron will is in French, but again, you can't quite imagine.
Volonté de faire.
Volonté de faire. I can't imagine quite a British or German politician describing themselves as having an iron will.
Oh, I can. Thatcher? Or do you think she was show not tell?
I think more show not tell.
Yeah,
I think
possibly.
We might tease somebody who described themselves as having an iron will. And then the final thing, I guess, just in sort of stylistic terms, is it's this tendency to put everything into a speech. So if you look at that Sorbonne speech, he's not just talking about nuclear deterrent, he's also talking about libraries. I mean, literally every idea he has in the world has been stuffed into a 2-hour speech where everything's connected.
But isn't that what you do at party conference speeches, for example? You could definitely... I hope he listens to this. I actually loved the bit about the libraries. He was basically saying that, we're losing literature, we're losing the love of books, and we're losing libraries as a centre of the community. I'm not saying that's in the same pillar of the speech as nuclear annihilation, which he talks about. But I just wish we had more politicians who did the big vision thing.
I think the other thing is that we can become a bit mesmerized by the fact that Macron is very clever and he does what other people don't do, which is give these kinds of speeches. I think there are two challenges I'd make to his vision. One of them is the style, which we talked about a little bit, and the other is the substance. So on the style part, again, what he's not doing, which I think a German politician would probably want to do, which is develop one idea in detail with proper background papers and policies. So I'm making a speech on industrial policy. Here are 15 policy background papers and developments. Or I'm making a speech on nuclear deterrence. Here's my whole developing. But the second thing is the substance. The most radical bit of it was around industrial policy. And basically he's saying that we're being beaten by China and the US. And the reason we're being beaten by China and the US is that they're subsidizing their industries. He keeps coming back to this. He keeps talking.
He also makes the point that he says the Americans have given up trying to get China to conform to the rules of international trade. Implied in that is that, and so now are the Americans. So we have to kind of catch up.
Yes.
So that is the route to protectionism.
Absolutely. So protectionism, and then huge amounts of industrial investment he wants. He's talking about a European DARPA. DARPA is this defense research setup which the Americans had, and which was beloved of Dominic Cummings, who wrote endless emails.
Your hero.
Exactly, absolutely. Wrote my rival to appear on this podcast, almost your co-presenter.
That was a very bad idea by somebody other than myself.
So anyway, Dominic Cummings was absolutely obsessed with the idea that what we need to do was have a big government-funded research project, and this is what Macron wants in France. And so what he's imagining is that you would end up with Europe borrowing a lot of money. So he talks a lot about the fact that what we need is a central European budget so that you can do the kind of deficit financing that happens in the US and China. And then that money...
And Germany are not going to do that.
And then that money needs to be pumped into picking winners. So you choose 3-4 countries that are going to lead Europe on quantum computing, 3-4 countries that are going to lead on AI, 3-4 that are going to lead on space. And Sophie Pedder gets into an argument with him and says, but how's that going to work? Because in Europe, there's a principle of fair return, which basically says that if all the European countries are chipping in, they should all get a bit of a benefit. And he says, well, that's completely inefficient. We can't have a situation in which, some random country down in the Balkans gets all the investment. What we really need is to get behind success, pick winners, and put huge amounts of European money in behind. In other words, to be a bit cheeky, basically, what he is imagining is turning the whole of Europe into a giant vision of France.
Which is not a bad leader for not a bad vision for a French president. On the populism stuff, you mentioned that we interviewed Kyriakos Mitsotakis, the Prime Minister of Greece, which is going to be on Leading in a few weeks. I loved the fact that he is putting anti-populism at the heart of his messaging. And Macron was kind of doing that. He didn't mention Le Pen, but that's obviously sort of, what he's trying to do is to find a counter vision.
Kept mentioning their party, didn't he? And kept suggesting they were a sort of Brexit party.
Yeah. The other thing that was, so yesterday, we're recording this on Tuesday, and yesterday he had this big bilateral thing with President Xi Jinping.
Which is anticipated in this. He was very careful to say, I don't want to ally with the US against China.
Exactly.
That's up to the US, but we have our own foreign policy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Xi Jinping is coming to Europe for the first time in 5 years. He's going to Paris, where he has seen Macron and Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president. He's then going to Serbia, and he's then going to Budapest, Hungary.
He's meeting Vučić and Orban.
He's meeting Vučić and he's meeting Orban, and that is clearly, they are two countries that China think they can push much closer into their own orbit.
And just to remind people, these are on the very nationalist fringes of Europe. So Orban, obviously a big populist, but Vučić, as we've talked about in Serbia, is making very nationalistic noises towards Northern Kosovo and Republic of Srpska. And they are the two countries that I guess European leaders are most worried about and therefore be most concerned. And not visiting Britain.
Not visiting Britain.
And is that, it could be any number of things, but I presume it's also partly about the fact that they sense that Britain has become very, very aligned with the US and the anti-China policy. And they see more productive relationships with France and Germany.
It could be. And today, on our news here in the UK, this big story about the MOD being cyber attacked. Government at this stage not saying which hostile state was responsible, but the word is it's China. Now, is that deliberate? Is the timing deliberate, either from our perspective or from the Chinese? But I watched Macron's...
Certainly with the Chinese, it would be deliberate.
I would have thought so.
Yeah, I mean, and actually, it's a very interesting bit of sort of soft undercover intelligence diplomacy. You coincide. Look at Macron, look at Hungary, look at Serbia. We get Chinese visits, the premier turns up, and then look at Britain, you get a cyber attack.
Yeah. No, and it was a very interesting press conference because Xi Jinping made all sorts of diplomatic noises, but there was this kind of undercurrent the whole way through. It was fascinating to watch Macron watching him and listening to him. It was almost like he was trying to read between the lines as well. But I do think going to Serbia and then Hungary, and of course Hungary is, I think, the only European country that's fully fledged part of the Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, my final point on this, Rory, do you remember the German word I taught you last week?
Oh my Lord, no, I've forgotten it. Go on, once more.
Wehrpflicht.
Very good.
Compulsory military conscription.
Yeah.
Which I thought the Germans would absolutely hate. So I picked up a new German newspaper yesterday. There was a poll, and we'll talk about this when we do our poll, because we asked the same question of the British public. There is a majority in Germany in favour, quite narrow, 48 to 45, of bringing back conscription.
Amazing.
Isn't it?
Amazing. And it could, I mean, Britain isn't there yet, but... Yeah,
Britain is there. So I can exclusively reveal ahead of us talking about the poll. Britain is there.
Go on, what's the numbers?
I can't remember the numbers. We'll talk about them when we talk about the poll.
Well, let's get in the poll. So I'm very excited about that. So finally, just to get back to this question of industrial strategy and the French dream and Macron's dream, and this is me going to be a cheeky, more right-wing conservative than you. I would say that actually his vision, which would basically involve bureaucrats in Brussels picking winners and making big industrial bets around Europe, is the wrong way to go. I mean, this is a bureaucracy in Brussels which has struggled to spend structural funds. And in fact, the real successes in Europe are much more decentralized. The people who are doing best actually on research, investment, patents, productivity are bits of Sweden, bits of Denmark, and bits of Germany. And even in Germany, it's not driven by Berlin. It's delegated down to the federal level. This is something we talked about with Manchester and Birmingham, that actually the future of industrial policy is much more decentralization, not this kind of Macron idea of some grand French monarch controlling a European bureaucracy and saying, we're going to throw, hundreds of billions behind quantum computing.
Good. Well, let's turn to South Africa. Election at the end of this month, and it's 30 years ago this week that Mandela was inaugurated as president. And I think it's fair to say the first decade of post-apartheid South Africa was an incredible success story, economically, socially, politically. And since then, a very, very, very mixed picture. They've got, so the ANC, the government has won every election. But the vote share, 70% in 2004, 66% 2009, 62 2014, 58 last time.
And that's the fascinating. I mean, I was talking to a South African friend yesterday who said to me, well, of course, the ANC may not get more than 50% of the vote.
Yeah.
And I was like, what country could that possibly be like an astonishing thing?
But it is.
South Africa, it is an astonishing
thing. But it is. And so it's very, very hard to get accurate polls. But I think they are in a little bit of trouble. I still think that, look, they're going to win. They will form the next government. The question is whether they will have to do it in coalition, and if so, with whom.
And one of the big problems is so that the polls seem to be varying between kind of 38, 45% for the ANC. One of their biggest problems is that they've broken with Jacob Zuma. Mm-hmm. Jacob Zuma, very corrupt, former leader of the ANC. Former president of South Africa, who's broken off and formed his own party called MK.
Yeah.
And he's built an incredible base in KwaZulu-Natal, particularly amongst Zulu voters.
Just to tell those who don't know the history, MK, which is the name of the military wing of the ANC. So essentially it's like sort of starting a party called the IRA to take on Sinn Féin.
And that's good details. So if the ANC doesn't get a majority, which they're likely not to get, they're going to face basically three choices on coalitions. There's the choice of going left, which is going with EFF and MK. So MK, we just talked about Jacob Zuma. EFF,
that's Economic Freedom Fighters.
Yeah, that's Julius Malema,
yeah,
who was the leader of the youth wing. They wear berets, and that's kind of Venezuela-style stuff.
We're talking Marxist-Leninism.
Yeah, proper Marxist-Leninism. So that's one coalition that people would be really worried about. If ANC went with them, that would be a big leftwards church. That would probably be expropriation of land, nationalisation of huge amounts of property, and probably a huge flight to capital. Second option, maybe the most likely, is to try to put together a sort of minority party coalition, maybe with IFP, which is a smaller right-wing party with Zulu voters. Slight collapse, actually, in that party vote because of what's happened with Jacob Zuma. And the third possibility that, of course, many people in the international community would be very excited about would be a coalition with the DA, which is the more kind of centre-right.
Democratic Alliance.
Democratic Alliance, yeah. Yep. And that's a very interesting party because more than 50% of its voters are white, more than 65% over 35. It's very much a sort of, and it's actually got a white leader. It's very much the sort of portrays itself as a kind of anti-corruption, sensible economic policy party, but I think very unlikely unless the DA does astonishingly well in the election and ANC does badly, that we'll end up with that coalition.
I mean, it is tragic the extent to which corruption has taken hold, particularly under Zuma. This phrase developed called state capture. And we were talking about tens of billions that were essentially looted from the state. And of course, Ramaphosa, who himself is one of South Africa's richest men, he was in politics, a huge figure in the anti-apartheid movement. We knew him very, very well because he was one of the independent commissioners on decommissioning in the Northern Ireland peace process. He left politics, became a very, very wealthy businessman, came back to politics, is president, and of course won in part by saying we've got to deal with this corruption. And although to some extent they have, there was a huge report on Zuma's state capture, but it hasn't really led to the sort of change that you would hope for. So it's going to be very, very interesting. I still think the ANC will do better than the polls are saying. There's a lot of talk that they will effectively buy off some of the smaller parties, buy them off with promises of what may happen under a future government. But and of course what Zuma has done, it's not just that he's had an impact upon the ANC share of the vote, he's also had an impact on EFF because of course they are seen as okay, they're very left wing and they're essentially in the ANC bigger family, but he's sort of fishing from that pool as well. So it's going to be a very, very, very interesting election. 70 political parties. 11 independents, so a very, very splintered, disorganised opposition.
And again, to remind listeners of the South African story. So South Africa, unusual, I suppose, because it had traditionally a very, very proportionally much larger white population than many other kind of colonial imperial setups. So as recently as 1960, nearly 20% of the population of the country was white, about 67% was black. So it was, and I think, nearly 1 million white citizens and about 3 million black citizens in 1960. That's changed now. It's now much, much more dominated, and the white population has dropped down to about 300,000. But it was, of course, along with the horrible, horrible racism and inequality and exclusion, was a very powerful economy in Africa. And if we take the story back to 1990, even with sanctions, South Africa was level pegging in GDP per capita with Brazil, Mexico, Thailand, Malaysia, Turkey. It was one of those kind of economies of that size. Fast forward 30 years, it's gone from being 107% of average GDP per capita in the world to about 70%. And one way of illustrating that is that if you're Thailand or Malaysia since then, your economy has more than tripled in size. The South African economy's barely grown by 100%. It's a long way now behind those countries.
Also, the last year, the World Bank identified South Africa as the most unequal country in the world. And I think the reason why the ANC is struggling is because the generation has grown up that doesn't necessarily feel the passion of the anti-apartheid story. 15 to 34-year-old age group, unemployment currently 44%.
Which is probably an underestimate too, because they don't count people who just aren't looking for work.
Yeah. So, and I think there's an awful lot of the young black population who just don't feel there's been progress made in their lives. And so in a way, it might be the first quasi-normal election, with the history not quite such a powerful factor. And the figures of history, like Zuma and to a lesser extent Ramaphosa, is sort of seen as part of the problem rather than part of the solution.
It's also the fact that although the end of apartheid brought political freedom and allowed black politicians to dominate politics, the economy is still tilted very, very strongly towards whites.
Yeah.
And although there are now a lot of very wealthy black people, there are unbelievably poor populations, almost all of whom are entirely black in South Africa. But it's still a country where, with all the economic problems and the corruption and the lack of growth, is totally vital to the future of Africa. I mean, it's 3 times wealthier per capita than Nigeria, which is the other great superpower of the country, of the continent. It produces nearly half of Africa's electricity. It has 3 million Zimbabwean refugees, 2 million Mozambican refugees that it's hosting. It's got the most productive, innovative workers in the whole of Africa. It's got probably the best infrastructure in Africa, the best education systems in Africa still. I mean, so it really matters. And so this election really matters, not just for South Africa, but for the whole region.
Yeah. Good. I guess final point on the DA, the Democratic Alliance, they're trying to put together this 11-party pre-election coalition. They call it the multi-party charter. But I just think that underlines how fragmented the whole political landscape is. And I still think that ultimately that benefits the ANC.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I look forward to us hearing from Macron directly.
For a bit of rebuttal. While we're talking rebuttal, can I just rebut one point that
yes.
we said in the podcast last week?
Yeah.
I went to see Burnley against Newcastle.
Yes.
As you probably know, Rory, we got hammered. And I was very pleased to hear that our manager, Vincent Company, is a regular listener to the podcast. And also pleased to hear that Steve Harper, who I'm sure you'll know.
He's not, it turns out, the Prime Minister of Canada. No.
That's Stephen.
Right.
So Steve Harper is the former Newcastle United goalkeeper.
Yeah.
And he now heads the Newcastle United Academy.
Right.
And he is also, he says he listens to every episode, and he said, I normally love it, but I did not enjoy, he said, i.e. my analysis of the academy system in football last week. He basically said, I was saying that the academies just sort of take these players in, sell them the dream, and then they spit them out, and they're only there to look after the really good players. He said, speaking for Newcastle, he said, we are very, very honest with them from the word go that very few are going to make it to the top. But he said, we sell them the experience of the academy and we give them a proper education. So I said I would promise to rebut on his behalf on the podcast.
Yeah, good. Okay, well, I think it's worth leaning into a bit. And I think I'd like to get Arsene Wenger on the show, if that's all right with you.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, I've been bidding to him for yonks, and he keeps saying yes. He's like the Michael Gove of football. He keeps saying he will, and then we don't quite get the date.
Then, speaking about football, next week, I'm going to be stepping out for a week and be replaced by an amazing Ipswich Town fan.
Ed Sheeran's coming on the podcast.
It's not Ed Sheeran.
Oh, okay.
And that is because I am going off on a silent retreat. So I'm going to spend 11 days, 10 days of which I will not speak. I'll be almost entirely in a dark room, sitting cross-legged for about 14 hours a day.
Bloody hell.
Meditating. And this is something that relates to our thing. This is what
Anthony
Gormley did, and Yuval Noah Harari did. And I absolutely love it. It's the third time that I've done it. Thank you very much for letting me have time. Also, particularly.
Well, hold on. What does your family say about this?
Well, they're people I really need to thank, because essentially I have no phone. I have no emails. You're not allowed a phone or email.
You won't even listen to David Gauke being brilliant.
Not allowed a book. Not allowed a pen and paper. You and all you do all day, and you stop eating before midday every day, is concentrate on your breath coming in.
For God's sake, this is my idea of hell.
So we'll see what this means for my reappearance on the podcast in 2 weeks' time.
Bloody hell!
I may come back, turned into some sort of,
But hold on, in Athens the other day, you
almost as saintly as Vincent Company.
In Athens the other day, you were saying that you've been travelling too much, you're still not seeing your family enough, and now you're going off for 11 days to sit in silence.
I know that's the case that can definitely be made against me. I appreciate that.
Anyway, listeners, rest assured that David Gauke will be very interesting, very entertaining, and look, maybe we should do a little poll at the end of it.
Just ditch me and get him on currently.
Yeah, let's see how it goes.
I could return having become fully enlightened, and when you brought the news to me, I won't mind because I'll be so relaxed,
chilled
and aware,
gormlified.
Yeah,
excellent. We'll have a nice time.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.